A safety plan is a practical plan that organisations and individuals can use to avoid certain occurrences from happening, and also to help them plan on how to respond if those occurrences do happen. Safety plans come in a range of different shapes and sizes. You might have come across personal safety plans, construction site safety plans, or maybe even a safe work safety plan under health and safety legislation. Sport Australia has developed a template safety plan for sporting organisations so that they can take into account essential considerations that you need to consider in preparing your organisation in its return to training and competition. The plan is essentially quite straightforward. Really, it covers the essential principles that underpin any return to sport plan. And these include the AIS National Framework for Rebooting Sport, as well as the national principles for the resumption of sport and recreation activities. The plan also looks at the roles and responsibilities for all those within your sporting organisation, and that's from people on the management committee or board through to your safety coordinator and your members and participants. And then finally, it sets out a checklist of the sorts of arrangements that your organisation needs to put into place to ensure that your sport operations and your facility operations are satisfactory for a safe return to sport. I really like safety plans because they are very useful tools to help sporting organisations navigate what is a really complex situation in returning to sport. Safety plans are important because they ensure that an organisation does some proactive thinking about safe ways of operating to reduce or avoid the risk of something occurring. Now, in this case, of course, it's the risk of a community transmission of coronavirus to someone else within your organisation. But just as importantly, once you've done your thinking and created a plan, that safety plan actually becomes your roadmap for your organisation to follow, led in particular by your safety coordinator, to ensure that you minimise your transmission risk, and also to guide your organisation's response should you suffer an occurrence of a community transmission within your organisation or your programs. In a practical sense, it's the safety coordinator who's responsible for developing and then delivering or even overseeing the delivery of the plan. That's why it's really important to appoint an appropriate person from within your club or association into that role. And that person should take into account the resource on the Sport Australia website that talks about the roles and responsibilities of the safety coordinator. Separately though, in a governance sense, it's the board or the management committee's responsibility to adopt the plan in the first place and then ensure the implementation of the plan is appropriate. The board or management committee should also take into account changing circumstances of the organisation, as well as any additional information that might be provided from a government or a health authority, and make changes and approve the changes to the safety plan. But in a general sense, everyone has a role to play in ensuring the requirements of the safety plan are met, whether that's through knowing what the plan requires of them, complying with the plan, or being responsible for their health or maintaining physical distance requirements. Ultimately though, the template safety plan that we've been speaking about does set out in some detail what the various roles and responsibilities of different groups in the club or the organisation actually look like. Well, I think the documents I'd like to talk about in response to that question are the two checklists and also the template safety plan and how they interrelate. Now, of course, the two checklists are intended to target two different audiences. So the more detailed checklist is really a checklist that can be best used by large to medium-sized organisations like national sporting organisations or state sporting organisations, whereas the simplified checklist may be better suited to local clubs and local associations. That's not to say that sports can't interact or interchange those checklists, so that a club or association may look to the more detailed checklist, for example, but that is certainly the way that the documents have been designed in the first place. So before we talk about how you could use these tools, I should point out that the checklists and the template safety plan are not in fact mandatory documents, which is a question that has been asked by quite a number of people. However, the tools are actually very helpful for providing sporting organisations with expert guidance to deliver ultimately a very strong return to sport plan. However, there are a range of different resources in the marketplace now that you might look to tap into, particularly those from your state sporting organisation, your state Department of Sport, as well as perhaps your own sport, whether it's from the NSO or from the SSO, who's prepared some resources for you to use. If you do elect to use the toolkit resources that Sport Australia has made available, you should probably follow, or we recommend that you follow these steps. Firstly, you should review the checklist that you have chosen to use, whether it's the simplified or the more detailed checklist, just to get a sense of the issues that you should consider. At this point, it's not critical to complete that checklist, but it's certainly worth reading so that you understand the issues to take into account in devising a return to sport strategy. Secondly, at this stage, I think it's valuable to look at the resources that are available to you from your local government or health authorities, which may have an impact on the shape and requirements of your safety plan. At this point in time, it's also very useful to go to your sporting sector partners to see what sort of sport-specific requirements might be in place. As I say, national sporting organisations, state sporting organisations may have produced some materials that are very relevant for you to consider when pulling together your safety plan. Once you've had a look at the checklist and once you have compiled some information from the government, health or sporting organisations that are relevant to you, it's worth distilling those considerations and that information into the safety plan to start to develop an organisational specific safety plan. Now what that means is that you go to the appendix of the safety plan, you work through the checklist in that appendix so that by the conclusion of the work in completing that appendix, you will have a very strong set of arrangements in the safety plan that you can use for both your sport operations and your facility operations in a post-COVID environment. Once you've completed or prepared your safety plan, it's then advisable to go back to your checklist and go through it with a fine-tooth comb and complete the checklist by checking off each of the relevant items as well as signing the document as indicated. By doing this process, it does mean that you can check to see that you have taken into account all the considerations that are relevant in completing a safety plan. And then once you've done all of these steps, the next thing, or the last thing perhaps for you to consider, is whether you have any specific requirements from your state government, your state Department of Sport, as to submitting for consideration a return to sport plan. I know that the Northern Territory government, as well as the Western Australian government, does require the submission of information into a safety plan portal. By contrast, in Victoria, for example, state sporting organisations are asked to submit their safety plan to an expert advisory panel that will take into account that plan and provide some advice on how perhaps it could be changed, improved or otherwise. That plan, once it's reviewed by the Victorian Expert Advisory Panel, can be cascaded from the state sporting organisation down into clubs and associations. Having a plan and sticking to it, the point of this conversation today has been around the importance of having a safety plan. But really what it does do is provide not a get out of jail card per se, but it does give you a plan of how to keep an organisation out of trouble by reducing the likelihood of a community transmission risk within your organisation. But equally, it gives you a very good roadmap to follow should something happen around you in the form of a community transmission. It's a really complex environment trying to navigate your way through the return to sport. So having something like a safety plan is really fundamental for helping simplify that whole process. Secondly, I think the role of safety coordinator is so critical that the second tip would be appoint the safety coordinator and provide as much support to that safety coordinator as you possibly can. Now, the safety coordinator has a really central and fundamental role to play in that they not only have control of the safety plan and how it's implemented within your organisation, but they are a very critical point of contact both for your internal groups as well as your external groups. So they know what's going on as well as anyone in your organisation. So really get around the safety coordinator, provide them with as much assistance and support as possible, because without them, it would be a far more difficult set of circumstances to navigate. And the third one, I think, comes back to communication. And that means, as you'll see from the checklist documents, having a communication strategy. And a communication strategy isn't just putting posters up around your club rooms or around your facilities. It's about proactively communicating with your stakeholder groups, and that is to give them an understanding of the expectations that are required of them. And that is communication now, proactive communication. And it's by email, it's by WhatsApp, it's by Facebook, it's by whatever means of communication you can possibly use to get the messages through, because you really need your stakeholder groups to understand your requirements and what's set out in your safety plan, and to really live by those when they come to participate in your programs or attend your facilities. Just to sneak a sort of a subset of that third one in too, if I may, when you're communicating with your members and participants, it would be very, very valuable to also emphasise to them the importance of contact tracing. So encourage them to be using the COVID Safe app at all times, but particularly when attending your facilities, and also to inform them of the requirement to sign on to attendance registers whenever they are attending your facilities. So that would be my top 3 tips. Oh, I think it's absolutely important. From my own personal perspective, I've been working with a range of national and state sporting organisations recently, and it's really been heartbreaking to see how much pain and suffering is going on within those organisations. Firstly, because they can't offer for sport to the wider Australian public, but secondly, because of the large number of staff and volunteers that they've had to stand down. And when you extrapolate that out across the 220,000 or so people that work in Australian sport, as well as the 1.8 million volunteers who make great contributions into Australian sport, you can really see that there is a lot of pain and hurt within those groups. So I really support what Rob Dalton said about return to sport, which is that as a community, we really have one shot to get this right. We don't want to see a recurrence of COVID come back into our community and into our Australian sporting life. So for that reason, I really commend the toolkit and the safety plan template and the checklists that Sport Australia has developed, because they give sporting organisations a great chance to bring sport back in a safe and timely fashion.